Hello, welcome to this episode of the DHF podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Sam. I'm also a DHF board member and a church planner, and I have with me Drew.
I am Drew McClellan, and I am the lead pastor at First Christian Church, Port Arthur, Texas, and the newly, elected chairman of the DHF board. And we're happy to have Evan with us. Evan, if you would give us a little bit of an introduction here.
Yeah, my name is Evan Minton. I run a website called Cerebral Faith. That is www.cerebralfaith.net. I started out as a blogger, writing apologetics topics, Kalam cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument, moral argument, ontological argument, problem of evil, historical Jesus stuff. There's like pretty much anything that's relevant to an intellectually satisfied Christianity. That's what I study and write about. I was on Blogspot for a long time until I started to grow more into a content creator with the podcast and the YouTube videos. And so I moved over to WordPress for a more professional looking website. I got into apologetics when I was 18 and had a real major crisis of faith. I was not taught apologetics as a child or as a teenager. I was raised in a Christian home and I was taught the Bible. But I was what you would call a nominal Christian. I kind of believed Christianity was true. I would go to God occasionally in prayer if things got bad, or if I was worried. But I didn't have a relationship with him. When I was 17, after I went through some stuff, the Lord really got to me, and that's when I actually became born again. And I very quickly became on fire for Jesus, as they say. And I tried to share my faith with pretty much everyone I could find. I tried to share it online, and when I did, I was met with pushback from these atheists, and their arguments are really, really, really bad in retrospect. But at the time, they just shook me to my core. So I asked God, if you're real, show yourself to me. I remember the verse from Mark 9 where the father of a demoniac asks Jesus, he says, "I believe, help me with my unbelief. I have just enough faith to know that if you're real, then you're going to help me. Because if the Bible is true, then, you're not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And if I don't believe in you and I become an atheist or whatever, then I'm going to go to hell. And you don't want that, says the Bible." So, it was I was putting God to the test. I'm like, if you're there, you're going to help me keep believing. And he did. Very soon, I was introduced to Lee Strobel's books, Case for Christ, Case for Creator, Case for Faith. And I was just astonished at what I was reading. And then I would read that stuff. I would share it with skeptics I would come across. And eventually I was like, I should put this in the form, I should start writing a blog, because I just have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again. So started Cerebral Faith, put my thoughts into blog form, and the rest is history.
I love the logo. I remember when you redesigned the logo a couple of years back, I believe. And so I found you somehow in an apologetics group, because I'm an apologetics guy, was a full-time apologist for a couple of years. If we happen to have listeners who are unfamiliar with that term or where it comes from, 1 Peter 3:15, it's apologia in the Greek. It means to make a case, or make a defense is the way we translate it. Always be ready to give a defense for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and meekness. And really, being a pastor, I got to do the Greek thing. Really, it's it's an ongoing, always being ready. I mean, it's that kind of thing. You're able to respond to those that have some doubts, questions, those kinds of things. And you've got evidence that says, here, this is why we know this is true. And we were in some kind of apologetics group together. And so I've known Evan for a while. I've really wanted to have you on. And you fairly recently gave a talk on the Maximal Data Argument. By the time folks are hearing this, this is after Easter, the way we record and set up. But we target pastors and Christian leaders, and we get a little bit of everybody. my hope is hearing some of this can remind folks that just celebrated Easter, hey, it wasn't just a big emotional Sunday. We're celebrating something that's true and we can verify. So Evan, could you just share what this maximal data argument is?
Yeah. So the term was, I believe, coined by Lydia McGrew. I didn't really hear this approach is actually as old as apologetics itself, but I really didn't start hearing the name until Lydia McGrew, Tim McGrew, and the McGroupies started throwing it around. And I think it's because they want to contrast it with what is known as the minimal facts approach, which is championed by scholars like Gary Habermas and Michael Icona. I've used the minimal facts approach for most of my time as a Christian apologist. I discovered it in 2014 in the book that they co-wrote, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which came with an interactive CD so you could test how much you learned. And I really gravitated towards the minimal facts approach because when I said I cut my teeth on the case for Christ, and when I would try to defend the resurrection of Jesus, I felt like I had to produce a lot of evidence that the Gospels were historically reliable, trustworthy sources, and I just had to info dump my interlocutor. And the minimal facts approach just seemed so much faster because you could just use what is called the criteria of authenticity that New Testament scholars use. So the death of Jesus, it meets the criterion of multiple attestation because, Josephus talks about it, Tacitus, Marabar Serapion, and you also have the Synoptic Gospels and John. So a lot of sources independent of each other mention it. Therefore, it's most likely to be a historical fact. And then you'd have the empty tomb. One argument that's very popular for that is women were the first ones at the scene, and women were not very credible witnesses in that culture. They were second-class citizens. It was a very patriarchal culture. And Josephus says they weren't even permitted to serve in a Jewish court of law. Usually, they would bring in, you got to be careful about that. They would bring in women as a last resort. Well, these women were the only ones who saw what happened, so I guess we have to go with them. So if they were making it up, why would they include women at the tomb? This must have been the way it really happened, and therefore the empty tomb is a historical fact. And so you can just kind of make these arguments of right there, I just defended the historicity of two facts, Jesus' death and his empty tomb. And it's just a lot faster. And once you get your arguments for these facts, then you're well, what's the best explanation of these facts? And at that point, you can debate with your non-Christian friend. Well, did they hallucinate? Did someone steal the body? Or, did Jesus rise from the dead? And so I basically just gave up defending the resurrection from, gospel reliability because I'm this is just so much easier. It's faster. You've got scholarly consensus on your side. So that's useful, helpful rhetoric in a debate setting because you can say, well, it's not just, fundamentalist Christians saying these things. Your guys, people like Bart Ehrman, they're saying these things are historical facts as well. And they're using the same arguments. But last year, I started going through, I wanted to make a blog post series and podcast series on gospel reliability. So I read a whole bunch of books, watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos from Eric Manning and Lydia McGrew.
And if folks don't know, Eric Manning does Testify, I believe is the name of his YouTube channel. Love that. Love the content there. And Timothy McGrew is actually a professor of philosophy, but his wife is just, I think she listed in one of her books or something like that, a stay-at-home mom or something like that. That's she is a published scholar. She may be the smartest woman alive, in my opinion. And so I think very highly of both of them. But those are folks that you could dig into to learn more from. Yeah.
And I read like a whole bunch, I already knew the evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels to a certain extent. Some of this was refresher course, and some of it was new stuff that I learned. A lot of new stuff from McGrew's books. And I felt overwhelmed just writing an 11-part series because there's so much evidence. There's so much to talk about. But there was always the concern also of like, well, how in the world are you going to like make this practical? How are you going to use this in a debate and dialogue setting? And over the course of my studies, I also interacted with McGrew's arguments against the minimal facts approach, why they don't, and why that approach doesn't work. I still think the minimal facts argument is a sound argument for the resurrection. But I make a long story short, I eventually just came to the conclusion that you can use a maximalist or approach for the resurrection, and you don't have to produce the contents of a book every single time.
Just to add a little bit more clarification, if viewer or listener doesn't know, the minimal facts approach is looking at things that scholars are kind of granting you, and that even secular scholars, and you're looking at this small amount. And so part of the pushback is that process of allowing other people to kind of determine that and not looking at the full data and some of that. So there's some pushback out there. I personally think it's a tool in the tool bag, right? It works for some folks, and we can always take them deeper. But I understand some of the concerns if that's all you're using. I really do.
Yeah. And that's the way I was. I was using the minimal facts approach exclusively. I was not ever defending the reliability of the Gospels. And as McGrew points out, that can inadvertently give skeptics the impression that the Gospels can't be defended. The reason you're using this approach is because you have to, because the Gospels are unreliable. That's one unfortunate side effect from that.
I told you before we started, I listened to the entirety of the lecture you gave, and I thought it was fantastic. And I think you have a solid point. And what Sam said too is, if you start relying too much on other people, then it really does say, okay, you're saying that we don't need the scripture at all. We can just rely on all the scholars who point us in other directions. But you had a really good point, and I've talked to you before about this, and I want to get into it even further about the maximalist approach. Is there is no limit to the evidence. There's nothing that's inadmissible. You can add as much as you want to that defense. And for me, somebody who rambles when they talk, that's actually really reassuring because, Sam, you know this, I have an older congregation as far as age, but as far as biblical literacy, they kind of stumbled a little bit in that area. And to see where we're going now in the 4 years that I've been here, and to see them dive deeper, you have to have as much evidence as you possibly can when you're looking at these things, especially when it comes to the resurrection, because without the resurrection, there's no reason to even be doing what we're doing. If the resurrection is not true, then nothing else matters, and we might as well pack it up and go home. So will you talk a little bit more about the ability to use literally as much as you possibly want and to compile that in?
Yeah. So, and one thing that came out of my studies is it felt like I was born again. Like I was sitting on my front porch, and at the same time, I came to the realization of how you can use this approach efficiently in a short conversation. I was also just thinking about the evidence, and I became more certain that Jesus is alive than I was before. The main objection, and even Michael Licona has made this objection on Trinity Radio with Braxton Hunter, is that it just takes too long. You've got to. I felt like, well, I've got to defend traditional authorship. I've got to talk about like a dozen undesigned coincidences. I've got to talk about archaeological findings at places where Josephus and Tacitus and extra biblical authors corroborate it, and I've just got to go through all this stuff to show the Gospels can be trusted, and then I can talk about why we should believe the resurrection. But in my conference talk, I make the case that if you want to use a short form of the argument, all you have to do is defend the traditional authorship of the Gospels. That will take you a few minutes, but it won't be as much. It shouldn't take you any longer than it would to give one or two criteria-based arguments for each of the minimal facts. You can give some reasons why Matthew, the former tax collector, is the author of Matthew. Why John, the fisherman, is the author of John. Why Mark wrote Mark, and he got his information from the Apostle Peter. And the reason this is important is because Matthew, Peter, and John, they were people who were there. They walked with Jesus. They ate with Jesus, and they're the ones who are saying, he died, and then we found his tomb empty, and then he showed up to us, and he was talking to us, and he was eating fish, and he was doing all these things and teaching us. He was saying, hey, the Old Testament prophesied that he was just doing all these things. And so if the eyewitnesses, Jesus and the eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham, if they're the ones telling you these things, then there's really only three options as to why they're saying what they're saying. They are either lying, they're just making up tall tales out of their imagination, they're mistaken, they thought they saw the risen Jesus doing these things and saying these things, but they were somehow wrong. They were somehow mistaken, or they were telling the truth. And if that last option is true, Jesus is really alive. Lydia McGrew, I call it the McGrewian trilemma. And I put it in my talk, in my PowerPoint, I put it in the form of a syllogism. 1, the gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. 2, the gospel authors were not lying or mistaken. 3, therefore they were telling the truth. So what you do is you defend traditional authorship, and you can give any number of arguments for why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then after that, you look at the details of their testimony, and then you defend the premises of the argument. Were they lying? Well, a quick way to rule that out would be to appeal to the extra biblical evidence for their martyrdom, just like you would do in ruling out the stolen body theory and a minimal facts approach. Why would they die for a lie, something they made up? If they made it up, then it would just be so much easier to just renounce that when the pressure is on. Liars make poor martyrs. What about the mistaken option? Well, if you look at the details of their testimony, they really just can't be mistaken about this kind of thing. I don't know how much time I have to get into that, but the listeners can check out my blog series. They can check out my conference talk, if they want to, unpack that. But that's basically a quick form of how to do it. And hey, as far as the lying option, if the martyrdom evidence is not enough, because some, like Matthew's martyrdom is not, is the attestation to it is not as strong as, say, Peter or Paul. Sean McDowell has talked about this in his book, The Fate of the Apostles. There's a lot. You can just say, well, we have other reasons to believe that they were committed to telling the truth. Frank Turek uses the criterion of embarrassment in a cumulative way to say, look, they're committed to telling the truth. They were warts and all. You can use undesigned coincidences, which Lydia McGrew has a whole book on. You can just bring out more as needed in a conversational setting to say that your only viable options are they were mistaken somehow or they were telling the truth, but they were definitely not lying.
Your defense of Matthew in your lecture, I thought was fantastic, and I don't know why I'd never put it together. Is the money references? He was a tax collector, and if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but I don't know why I'd never put together the amount of money references in the book of Matthew compared to the other three Gospels.
Oh, and knowing his real name as Levi too, and you see the call outs to the corruption of the Pharisees. Like it brings scripture to life to know that there was this man who seems to have walked away from his calling. Levi would have been a Levite, worked with Rome. I have religious leaders, there's a bunch of hypocrites, and then he finds the real one. and he just pursues him wholeheartedly. It becomes so much more rich and alive to know those little details about Matthew. Sorry, I just had to throw that in.
The money thing. What Drew is referring to is, I am indebted to Eric Manning and Testify, because I first learned about this in he's got a great YouTube video on it. There's two categories of evidence for traditional authorship. There's external evidence, and then there's internal evidence. I personally find the external evidence a whole lot stronger from the patristics and from the manuscript evidence. But the internal evidence is interesting too, and I think it can add to a cumulative case. And in the case of Matthew, like you have, like, he talks about money a lot. And in some of the stories that Matthew tells, that sometimes Luke tells those same stories. One example is about forgiveness, Jesus' lesson on forgiveness. Peter comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother? As many as 7 times?" And Jesus says, "Not just 7 times, but 70 times 7 times." And then he says, I don't have a Bible in front of me, I'm just going off of memory, but he says, like, you should forgive others the way that God has forgiven you. And then Luke just carries on with the narrative. Matthew tells that same story, but he stops to record a parable of Jesus. It's the parable of the unmerciful servant. And this guy owes Matthew, this guy owes, like, the king or, his debtor, a ridiculous amount of money, and he can't pay it. So he begs him for mercy. Just please release me from this debt. The master has pity on him and says, "Okay, I'm not gonna hold this debt against you." But then he goes and he finds someone who owes him money, and it's a whole lot less than what he owed, like, his master. And he will show that same mercy. And his fellow servants, they see this, they're troubled by it. They go to the master, and he's outraged. And he's like, "I take it back. I'm going to make you pay all of this after all." And then Jesus says, "That's how my Father's going to treat you. If you do not forgive your brother from your heart." Now, we can imagine if this is Matthew, he's a former tax collector. He knows full well the horrible consequences of not being able to pay your taxes. The Romans were brutal. We can imagine that Matthew might be feeling some guilt from that. And so that teaching of Jesus, it would have stuck out to him. Whereas, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, but whoever he's getting it from, they might have remembered the teaching about how important it is to forgive, but the teaching about the money-themed parable might not have stuck out to them as much. Because, and I go into this in my blog post series, I give, like, an analogy of, me and my friend, we go to a new church, and, like, I notice people wearing a bunch of anime shirts, but he may notice, like, beautiful paintings because he's an art student. We have different personalities, we have different interests, and so we might see the same thing, and we might report the story in roughly the same way, but we'll mention details that maybe the other guy doesn't, because they were more interesting to us or they stuck out to us. And as a former tax collector, things like a money-themed parable would stick out to him.
Yeah, that's great. And other things would stick out to Luke, right? Like medical terms that other people don't use. He was a doctor, and we see that, elsewhere in Scripture. And I'm thinking of just those undesigned coincidences as well, which is a great, I really love that. And it was really the McGrews that introduced me to J.J. Blunt and that original idea of, hey, look, these things fit together like Velcro over here in this gospel, or even from Scripture and history. And then they cling together and it makes a tight case that this is legit. Like, these are, because people don't write fiction that way, especially then. They did not write like historical fiction with ties to reality.
Yeah. And even if they did, like, you might have like 2 or 3 novels written in the 21st century about the Civil War, but they're not going to include details that interlock in that very subtle way as we find in the Gospels, because they're not eyewitness testimonies. They're novels. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to get things wrong. Like, I remember going in high school or right after high school to see Pearl Harbor, and it got a few little bits wrong, and that's pointed out, those kinds of things. Yet we see in Luke and Acts, Acts specifically, we see all these things that they got right. And we even see things that they get right that we didn't know they got right until later, until we found more archaeological evidence. And so it just testifies, hey, they're telling the truth.
Yeah, and so when you're giving a maximal data argument, like I defend like the efficient. I'm responding to like what I call the efficiency objection. But if this is someone you can have, ongoing conversations with, you're meeting up with them, over and over again on a. You can go into more and more of this over time. You can talk about, like, maybe you just start off with the short version. Defend the traditional authorship of the Gospels, look at their testimony, do the McGrewian trilemma, and be done with it, and just kind of, rule out all the alternatives, explanations to them telling the truth. But maybe your friend, like, isn't totally convinced that they're not lying. Well, the next time you see him, you can be like, well, let's talk about some of this archaeological evidence that, like, confirmed things that we didn't even know they got right. Things that New Testament scholars said, oh, they just totally messed this up. But then we found archaeological evidence that showed John or Matthew, they got it right after all. Or let's talk about these undesigned coincidences and like the nature of eyewitness testimony versus fictional narratives. And then maybe in the third conversation you have with your friend, you can talk about I don't know. You can talk about how the criteria of authenticity makes a cumulative case for their reliability. I learned this from Frank Turek. He does this, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And so you can just, Lydia McGrew has a great analogy. You don't bring out all your pots and pans at once. You just bring them out as needed. And if you realize you need one more plate, then you can bring that plate out.
And those of us that are pastors, we can do this in our sermon series, or those any of us that are leading a small group, something like that. As I went through Luke, I just would throw these bits and pieces out. Or anytime I touched the gospel, I would make that, okay, here's how we know that this is who the author is. Make that case, because the people in the pews need to hear it. They got to hear that first before they can then share it with their friends.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, don't bring everything out at once is the best, especially when you're looking at a small group Bible study setting, because we've been kind of going through the entirety of the Bible. We're in 1st and 2nd Samuel right now, and the questions are constantly compounding. And you're like, okay, well, if you'd have remembered this from Leviticus, if you'd have remembered this as we came on, this is why God is punishing in this way. And now let's correlate that back to something that Jesus said and is recorded in one of the Gospels. And that's, I think that's the other thing, that the validity there that comes from the authorship, from that firsthand account, is something that we have to really go on to. It's like N.T. Wright said, we believe the Iliad and the Odyssey as a portion of tragic literature plus a little bit of historical fact off of one manuscript, but we refuse to believe the validity of the New Testament off of the multiple manuscripts that don't change throughout time.
Yeah.
And then we have X amount of copies of the Iliad. I can't remember the certain amount, but it just pales in comparison to the New Testament. And even the Old Testament, we know how it was transferred. I can recall having in my hands a 500-year-old scroll, and it had the Old Testament. And then I had a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then I had another copy. And you can just show things I could see and I could touch that the transmission was preserved. And it was powerful to have that and show that off when I was an apologist at a conference, things like that. Like, look, you can look and see we have what they wrote. Yes, there's some spelling changes. Yes, there's a tiny bit over here, that or there, right? Standardized spelling is fairly new anyways. So that's always my defense for anyone who has read anything I've written. But we have the content and it's great. Evan, I want to ask a practical question. Sometimes myself as an apologist, I hear, well, okay, this helped convince you. That's great. What impact does it have on your faith on a regular basis, aside from maybe an evangelism tool or a discipleship tool?
Well, when I got done with all of the research, and I was like, I went out to my back porch and I was just sitting. I was just reflecting on it. And this was this happened at this, around the same time that I realized, hey, there is a short version of the Maximal Data Argument. You don't have to write a book every time. As I was thinking about the data, it just dawned on me, hey, Jesus is alive. He is alive. He really is truly living and breathing. And it's not like I doubted that before, but it's like now it was like really, really real. It was the only thing that could have made it more real is if I was in Thomas's sandals and was able to put my finger in his side. But it was like, oh my gosh, this really isn't just a belief system. This is objective reality. God entered into the universe. He bled and died, and then he rose again. And that just, I hadn't had that level of epistemic certainty since I first came to Christ. And I think for me, apologetics has always helped ground me, just generally. The past couple of years have been really, really hard on me. For the past month, I've been battling with depression that I just couldn't seem to shake. I've been doing a little bit better now, but I've just gone through a storm like I've never been in before, and it just rages, and I'm just asking God for me to get into the eye of the storm if the storm isn't over yet. So I think about like the theodicies, the answers to the problem of evil. I think about the arguments for God's existence, like kalam and fine tuning, and I think about the evidence for the reliability of Scripture. And so even if I were to get really angry with God, I can't walk away from what I know. This is not just something I believe on the basis of a feeling, so a feeling can't change it. It's based in facts and logic and arguments. And so no matter what, C.S. Lewis said it well. He said, faith is holding on to what your reason once accepted in spite of your changing mood. So no matter how my moods are going, my mind still is like, well, you can't just become an atheist and shake your fist at God because he exists. He's the best explanation of the origin and fine-tuning of the universe. Jesus is risen from the dead. I also think of the words of Peter, in John 6, when everybody abandons him after he gives his, eat my flesh and drink my blood speech, he turns to his disciples kind of brokenhearted and he says, are you going to turn away from me too? And Peter says, Lord, to whom will we turn? You have the words of eternal life.
Beautifully well said. And that's the same thing for me. I've recently been focusing on learning about discipleship groups, things like that. And, there is a concern for so many in the church today that we're educated beyond our obedience. There are people that are not living out their faith. But I know for me, I obey because of what I know. Like I can't shake it. Like I can't go, I'm gonna go be selfish today, or I'm not gonna share the gospel, or I'm just, I can't do it. I know better. And it grounds me. Even when I feel miserable sometimes, he's there and I know it. So I got to keep marching forward. And even when I feel like, oh man, really great. Oh, hold on. I can't get excited about this other thing and chase after it. I'm on mission and I know that mission. And so it is that grounding for me that has been so important, because I've struggled with depression at different points in my life as well, that has kept me just going forward. And so I'm so glad you shared that I'm not the only one who feels that way. It's so helpful.
No,
Yeah.
that's the best argument. I mean, I'm always pushing the intellectual portion of our faith, and I think that's really the best argument right there. Somebody like yourself who has studied, who knows, and then you face that storm, that struggle, that constant barrage that Paul seems to constantly be writing about. And without that grounding of, to quote your website, cerebral faith, without that intellectual hold, I mean, it's really easy to fall apart. But like you said, when you know that, hey, I'm dealing with facts, there's really, what am I going to do? All of a sudden just become a denier of proven fact? No, that was fantastic. That's a good way to end, Sam. I don't know if we can top that. That was great.
I think we just need to let Evan plug his website again and anything else you got going on. And then we hope that you will continue to check out his material.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the website is cerebralfaith.net. Cerebral as in, cerebral palsy. That's not where I got the name from. I looked up.
I was thinking of cerebellum, cerebral.
I looked up the definition of cerebral. I was trying to come up with a name for the website, and I was like, hey, that's a pretty good name. Having to do with the intellect and the rationality. Cerebralfaith.net. And I'm not making YouTube videos anymore. The podcast has ended, and I go into some reasons as to why I've cut back on the content so much in the final episode of the Cerebral Faith podcast. But I am keeping the blog going, trying to churn at least a minimum of 1 or 2 articles out a month. And one that I'm working on right now is why you should believe in the Trinity, a response to the Watchtower Society. I've been evangelizing some Jehovah's Witnesses who have come to my door, and they have sent me some material, and I was making extensive notes, and I was thinking, hey, I haven't put an article out in a long time, and these notes are pretty darn extensive, so why don't I just make it into a response article? So I'm not sure when I'll be done with that. It might be a 2 or 3 parter because it is like a digital booklet. That's what I'm working on right now. So you can check that out. There's lots of, if you want to learn more about the maximal data argument, what we've been talking about today, I've got an 11-part article series on the website. And I say it's a blog post series, but it's really more, I accidentally wrote a book and put it on the website. They're very, very extensively footnoted. Each article is rather lengthy. But if you don't want to read all of that, I've recorded myself reading the articles and I put them up on the podcast. So it's kind of a pseudo audiobook for a pseudo book.
Well, Evan, thank you for sharing what you're doing. We hope everyone will follow. And even those older YouTube videos, even if you're not making new ones, a lot of those things are evergreen. I've seen some of those things. Go back and check those out. And we also would hope that wherever you're listening, that you would like, share, follow, those kinds of things. And we hope you would check out our ministry at discipleheritage.org. We're a voluntary network of churches, and we're helping Christian leaders continue to grow and do what they're called to do. Have a good one.